not to be able to pierce the luminous mist behind which the enemy would be able to form up and take new positions without our knowledge. Down behind the line of willows we could now barely distinguish, we were aware of mysterious sounds, making a kind of distant murmur. They must have come from the rattle of arms, orders given in whispers, footsteps slipping on fat soil of ploughlands. Listening heads craned over our parapets. Each man was trying to hear, to understand, to see and to divine, and each felt intuitively that the enemy was about to renew his assault. The most absolute silence and the most impressive calm reigned in our trenches. Yes, we were ready for them. Let them come. Then suddenly from the enemy's camp there rose a solemn, harmonious hymn sung by hundreds of manly voices. We could not distinguish the words uttered in the barbarian tongue, but the music was perfectly audible, and I must confess that nothing caused me so much surprise throughout this eventful evening. With what ardour and unanimity, and also, I am bound to admit, with what art these men proclaimed their faith before rushing on death. One could imagine no more magnificent temple for the prayers of the soldiers about to offer up their lives than the spacious firmament above and the luminous night around. We listened, touched and delighted. The hymn continued for some time, and the music seemed to me noble and inspiring. The voices were true and the execution admirable. But above all, the singing conveyed a disturbing impression of disciplined and ordered piety. To what length these men carry their love of command and obedience! Suddenly the hymn broke off abruptly in a formidable uproar, above which rose thousands of voices shouting, "Hurrah! Hurrah! Cavalry! Cavalry!" Then, dominating the tumult, we heard their trumpets sounding the short monotonous notes of the Prussian charge. I leapt back into the trench. "Independent fire!" The whole French line burst into a violent and deafening fusillade. Each man seemed full of blind rage, of an exasperated lust for destruction. I saw them take aim rapidly, press the trigger, and reload in a feverish haste. I was deafened and bewildered by the terrible noise of the firing in the narrow confines of the trench. To our left the machine-gun section of my friend F. kept up an infernal racket. But the German line had suddenly dropped to the ground. I could barely distinguish a swarm of grey shadows running about in the fog. Then not a single dark figure was visible on the pale background of the tragic scene. How many of the dark bodies we could no longer make out must have been lying lifeless, and how horrible their proximity must have been to the living stretched side by side with them. Our men had ceased firing of their own accord, and a strange silence had succeeded to the deafening din. What was about to happen? Would they dare to come on again? We hoped so with all our hearts, for we felt that if we could keep our men in hand and prevent them from firing at random, the enemy could never get to us. But above all, it was essential to economise our ammunition, for if we were short of cartridges, what resistance could we offer to a bayonet charge with our little carbines reduced to silence? The Germans must have been severely shaken, for they seemed afraid to resume the attack. Nothing was moving in the bare plain that stretched before us. During this respite an order came from the officer in command, passing from mouth to mouth. "Hand it on. No firing without the word of command." Then silence fell on our trenches, heavy and complete as on the landscape before us. Suddenly, on the place where the enemy's riflemen had thrown themselves on the ground, we saw a slim shadow rise and stand. The man had got up quietly, as if no danger threatened him, and, in spite of everything, it was impossible not to admire the gallantry of his act. He stood motionless for a second, leaning on his sword or a stick. Then he raised his arm slowly, and a hoarse voice yelled, "Auf!" Other voices repeated the word of command, and were answered by renewed hurrahs. Then the heavy line of riflemen sprang up again and rushed towards us. "Fire! Fire!" Once more our trenches belched forth their infernal fire. We could now plainly see numbers of them fall, but they suddenly threw themselves on the ground just as before. But instead of crouching motionless among the beetroot, they began to answer our fire. Innumerable bullets whistled about us. I noted with joy that my men remained perfectly steady, and they were aiming and firing deliberately, whereas at other points the fusillade was so violent that it cannot have been efficacious. I was very glad not to have to reprove my brave Chasseurs, for the uproar was so terrific that my voice would not have carried beyond the two men nearest to me. I calculated the number of cartridges each of them must have in reserve. 25, perhaps 30. How would it all end? I was just thinking of ordering my troop to cease fire in order to reserve my ammunition for a supreme effort if this should be necessary. But something happened which checked this decision. F's machine guns must have worked fearful havoc among our assailants, for suddenly, without a cry and without an order, we saw them rise and make off quickly, right and left in the fog. "Silence!" I was obliged to intervene to subdue the joyous effervescence caused in my troop. The men began to discuss their impressions in tones of glee that might have become dangerous. Ladoucette's voice was heard, as usual, above the din, calling upon his absent wife to admire his exploits. "Madame Ladoucette, if you could have seen that!" But we had to be on the qui-vive. The German attack had been checked, but it might be renewed. We were fully alive to the courage and tenacity of our enemies. I could distinguish nothing ahead in the increasingly thick white fog. All I could hear was the sound of pickaxes on the ground and the thud of falling clods. The enemy had, no doubt, decided not to attack again and were digging new trenches. They no longer uttered the contemptuous guttural cries of "Cavalry! Cavalry!" They had learnt to their cost that these French cavalrymen, at the sight of whom their own are so ready to turn back, could hold their own equally well against German infantry. I thought we might count on a little respite. The battlefield was silent, save for the faint cries occasionally uttered by the wounded. I hastily detached 2 troopers to man the listening posts, and they slipped away silently. Then, as our captain had unfortunately been summoned to Elverdinghe that day on a special duty, I went to look for the Major to make my report to him. My men were seated themselves on the rough ledges cut into the slope of the trench, their carbines between their knees, and were talking together in low tones. As I passed, a friendly smile lit up their faces. I walked slowly along the narrow trench, careful not to tread on the feet of the talkers. As I approached a point where the trench, following the direction of the wood, formed an abrupt angle, I heard 2 familiar voices exchanging the following words: 52, dearest Major, 3 aces. Capital. This really was the limit. I turned the corner and came upon Major B. and F. seated on the ledge, quietly playing cards by the brilliant moonlight. As their tiny retreat could not accommodate 4 players, they were solacing themselves with a game of piquet. Oh, all you who are of necessity far from the scene of the conflict, good Frenchmen and valiant Frenchwomen, how I should have liked you to see this picture! No doubt you often wonder whether those who are defending your homes against the accursed invader will be able to bear the sufferings of this war to the bitter end. You fear that they may be losing their good humour and their dashing spirits. You imagine them brooding with careworn faces and anxious souls when, the excitement of the encounter dying down, they think of what the morrow may bring forth. How I wish you could have seen Major B. and the gallant Lieutenant F. playing piquet in the trench where they had just repulsed a furious German attack, which might have been renewed at any moment. I left them to go on with their game, and went in search of my comrade O. I found him in the middle of his troop, talking amicably with his men. After the enemy had ceased firing, he had sent a party of sappers to dig the graves of 2 non-commissioned officers who had fallen in the wood. We retired into a corner of the trench, and there he told me of the grief he felt at this loss, a grief he was doing his best to hide, so as not to injure the morale of his troop. Lagaraldi had just got his promotion, and was a soldier of the highest promise. Durand was the model corporal, clean, cheerful and active. And even if they had been but mediocre troopers, I knew too well what we officers feel when we lose even a passable chasseur, to wonder at the melancholy of my charming young comrade. Time went on, and there were no signs of a fresh attack. The enemy's artillery seemed to be neglecting us and to be bent upon the destruction of the Boesinghe Bridge, by which we had crossed the Yser. His great shells flew over our heads with a sinister roar, and a few seconds later we heard the explosion far behind us. The German trenches in front of us were silent. A single shot fired at intervals alone reminded us that they were not forsaken. "Mon Lieutenant, all is ready." A corporal had come out of the woods to tell O. that the graves were dug. When we had sent word to our chiefs, and placed our non-commissioned officers in temporary command, Our strange, sad procession of mourners left the trenches and slipped through the thicket in single file.